So a lot of people come to us and say, which content management system should I use for our website, Drupal or WordPress? WordPress is much more frequently used. It's much more commonly known. And so it has a certain profile of advantages. Drupal has its own set of advantages. So we're going to talk a little bit about which one is advantageous depending on circumstances. WordPress was originally a blogging tool. And so its underlying structure and philosophies were I might have a basic homepage, and then I'm going to have a blog and maybe a contact. So basic web pages, but the ability to easily publish a blog over and over and over again, a blog being basically some text, some photos, and maybe an embedded video. Drupal, on the other hand, was fundamentally conceived as something quite different. It was originally conceived as a nodal architecture, meaning I'm going to put a piece of information out here and another piece of information out here, and then I'm going to draw from those pieces of information with structures that I can build a page from. And so that might be words and text like a blog or a page, but it might also be like an event, which might have a title for the event. It might have a starting time. It might have an ending time. It might have who's the featured person. It might have a geolocation that needs to go on a map. And so all that information going into a structure, one node, right, would then collect all of that information, and you can then pull those nodes together to build a list of events, which could go into a page as a block. And so Drupal is much more flexible in that way, in that it was designed to incorporate different kinds of information into these nodes and then display them through views into the database, which could then be customized. And so it's fundamentally a different, in its history and in its philosophical underpinnings, a very different tool than WordPress. It's not as well known because WordPress is like working with Legos. You open it up and you can just start clicking things together, and you got a big stack of blog pages just like a stack of Legos. Easy peasy. But with that sort of hard structures there, it's more difficult to make something curved. It's more difficult to put something that's not a Lego into the Lego stack, right? Drupal is more almost like clay, where you can create these different containers of information and connect them in different ways, like the K'NEX toys. And so Drupal, with that foundational flexibility, is just inherently more suited to sophistication, both in terms of information, but also in terms of how it's going to be skinned or themed or designed, and then and at some point, design and information architecture start to influence one another. And so we see the greatest design flexibility, both in terms of information and graphics, to be on the Drupal side, though there's plenty of beautiful websites built on WordPress. There's also many built on Drupal. Ultimately, we should look at some examples. So let's take a look at some of these WordPress websites that would be examples, and what features they have that WordPress supports. So the first website we'll take a look at is Elliott's Bakery. This is a historic bakery, a building and a place established back in 1931, downriver Detroit. And this is a WordPress site which has a real strong sense of beauty, populated with a lot of great imagery. And this is an example of some nice ornamentation that is on brand for the bakery. And a fair number of custom presentations, including, for example, some of this layering back here of, the sprinkles and the strokes and the labels on the buttons and the photography. And so this is an example of an elaborate WordPress website. It certainly can be done, and has been an extremely effective website for Elliott's. They can self-edit as usual, and embed videos, things like that. The combination of this website and this video about them has been extremely effective. They've been visited by members of US Congress, as well as featured on the front page of the Detroit News. I believe in the first year that this was launched, wedding cake sales went up by about a third, so a 30% increase. So an example of a nice, beautiful WordPress website, certainly capable of doing that. And then Flowers by Sleeman. This is a flower shop. This has got WooCommerce set up, so this is an e-commerce situation done well with fairly standard shopping experience and pretty much the things that you would expect. And so let's look at more of a sort of standard content website. This is my sister Maureen's website, and her books that she's written includes things like, because it's WordPress, it's nice to feature some blog type content. And she's a extremely skilled writer and builds a lot of content around this, looking at things like impact, lessons, some of the sports teams that she has worked with as well at the Olympic level. And so a very effective website built on WordPress with lots of tags and content around the blog, as well as featuring her the books that she's produced. Moving on then to Drupal examples, we have Kingstar, and we'll kind of start at the home page here. Kingstar campers are a very high profile, kind of super high quality camper that's produced by a family that I've been doing business with for over 25 years. And we can see not only a very custom design, the customization is more possible with Drupal, and the website has to have that high touch look to it. But in this case, we're going to go a step further and show where Drupal's flexible kind of node-based architecture lets us move over to, say, the products and take a look at, for example, well, let's go to where people often want to do. They want to get a quote on some of these things. And so this is where the features kind of come together. We can choose between the two categories of products they have, and then two kind of levels. And we'll choose the Premium Cruiser brand, and we'll pick a Cruiser 10 open range. And so this is an interactive price calculator that lets us update the prices here as we move along. We'll choose the CA flatbed and matte charcoal Silverton interior. And so the ability to price out these products interactively is a function of being not only good for the user, but it allows them to define everything that's available. So as this updates, we'll come down and I'll pick out this 18-inch flatbed garage, and we'll see that it's $59.90 right now. And in the future, I'm sure all prices will change. So let's talk about that dynamic a little bit. If we come over to the accessories page, we can see some interactive elements that are much more easily produced on Drupal than they would be in WordPress. Information like this with a kind of custom animations that transition between these different accessories. And then when I go to a specific accessory, we can see, if I come back over to the first ones, here's our flatbed garage. I've got specifications. I've got photos right here. I can go in and look at the photos in detail. And that type of sort of layered interactivity is also much more possible with Drupal. And what we can see then, if I look at this generally down here on flatbed garages, starting at $59.90, there's that same price, right, which is the price of the smallest version of it. And this is where we get into maintaining single source of truth. And Drupal is very effective at combining data of different types. And this is where, when there's a price change, we update it in one place. And that canonical source of truth then is propagated to all the different locations throughout the website. Pretty straightforward to do on Drupal and much more difficult to manage in a WordPress environment. Certainly possible, but more difficult. Okay, then looking at an extremely sort of high quality, this is a well-established historical hotel. and incidentally was just voted one of the like top 50 most romantic places and to stay. And so the website needs to have that high touch design. So every piece of this, exactly how this number one fits in for their first money theme of their first level theme of old money, right down to the textures in the background, exactly how each of these images look. Every piece of this is custom designed and custom coded so that it has that very high touch, high class presentation that goes with the brand of this hotel, right? So in this case, Drupal was useful from a styling and efficiency of styling perspective more than it was on, say, a data features page. If we look at data features from Drupal, the Ballo company, which is kind of property investment company, we can see, for example, the kinds of properties they invest in. And let's just choose retail buildings, for example. And I can see a list of their retail properties, and I can go and see a few bits of information. But we can take that same data about each property, which is structured, and look at it projected then on a map. I can go in and take a closer look at, they do a lot of work down here in Florida where they're headquartered, and we can kind of move in on some of these clusters and then pick a property and see some data about it, as well as images. That's presented here well, and I can go right back to the map as soon as I'm ready. And so this allows us to use that data in ways that are useful for the client and employ them in this case in a mapping action. That's also filterable with these elements. If I come over here then to Swiss American, this is an example of a website which, again, super high quality products. And I'm going to show one feature here, which is this kind of red arrow, which runs down through multiple rows of content and behind it. And yeah, that's seems pretty basic, pretty straightforward. It's actually quite complex to pull that off within modern templating systems, but we can do that in a Drupal environment. So here we have IMBA.com, which is the International Mountain Biking Association. And this is a website which is not developed originally by Monte and is maintained by a third party. But those partners, as well as IMBA, approached us with the interest in developing a custom map for their homepage here that shows the impact that IMBA has in terms of community engagement across the United States. And so this is a data-driven feature, which we have put together for them, and we did it on a sterilized version of their website with no user information. So it gets into the workflows that allow us to support security, but allows not only for filtering of the different types and levels of engagement that they've achieved with the different communities around the United States, but also allows us to search for specific locations. So I'll reset, and I can take a look and see what's happened here. And if I just pick Colorado, for example, I can see the featured locations, and I'll scroll in on Colorado and take a look, right? I can reset that and take a look over here, in California, where there's a lot of population density, so there's some, dense locations and clusters, and see that density here. I can also, query an individual location and see, what the name of that community is, or if it's a featured location, I can go to a, further information around these sort of key projects. So the point here is a mix of the ability to set up data, import data, populate systems with data, and even have entirely different pieces of information come up through some of these elements. And so Drupal's very good for this, and we leverage it to the max for features like that. So, in summary, if someone wants something that's fairly straightforward, semi-static except for a blog, maybe similar to other websites, then WordPress is often a very good example, and it can still be beautiful if there's good content and good imagery to work with. But if you want something that's beautiful or bespoke, right, or has badass features, then this is where Drupal should probably be considered for that type of project. So ultimately, the